Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Fukushima, Living in the Shadow of a Nuclear Disaster. My name is Becca Choate. I'm Associate for Global Advocacy and Education at Global Ministries, and I wish to welcome you all today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to my coworker, Area Executive for Asia and the Pacific, Derek Duncan, to introduce what we're going to talk about today. So Derek, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Becca. Good afternoon or good morning, as it may be the case. As Becca said, I'm Derek Duncan, Area Executive for East Asia and the Pacific for Global Ministries. Global Ministries is a common mission witness of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada and the United Church of Christ in the US. In today's webinar, we are remembering the terrible events of the triple disaster that occurred in Northeast Japan on March 11, 2011. The earthquake centered off the coast of Tohoku Prefecture, the historic tsunami it created that flooded towns and villages down the coast south of Sendai, and the nuclear contamination of the land and people caused by the fracturing of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. We will begin with a very brief background video about the disaster, and then in an interview with Terumi Kataoka, representative of the Aizu Radiation Information Center in Fukushima, we will learn about some of the ongoing efforts of the church and global ministries partners in the region to respond to the continuing legacy of radiation, displacement, and pain that endures to this day. After the video, we will have a time for questions, and then we will close with a moment of prayer and reflection for the tens of thousands killed in these tragic events and their aftermath.
My name is Jeff.
So we're very glad that you've joined us today. Today's webinar will feature an interview with Terumi Kataoka, representative of the Aizu Radiation Information Center in Fukushima Prefecture. Located about 75 miles east of the Daiichi nuclear power plant, the Aizu Radiation Information Center was established in May 2011 to monitor the radiation levels in the area and to network and advocate for victims and others affected by the disaster. Terumi will share about what life has been like in the decades since the triple disaster and about some of the legal and public advocacy work in Aizu seeking to protect the rights of those who continue to be displaced and endangered by nuclear contamination. Longtime Global Ministries co-worker in Japan, Jeffrey Menzendick, translates for Terumi and also gives his perspective. This interview is about 30 minutes.
My name is Jeffrey Menzendick. I have been working for Global Ministries for, I think, 31 years now in Japan. And as you know, we had our big earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster on March 11th, exactly 10 years ago. And at that time, I was living in that area and got involved in the relief effort. Today, I have a good friend, Terumi Kataoka, and we're going to be hearing from her, especially because she lives in Fukushima. She was born and grew up there. Her husband is a pastor and a good friend of mine, and we were working together in the relief effort at that time. And Terumi and local people in her area, right after the disaster, started something called the Aizu Radiation Information Center. And they have been monitoring, they've been trying to gather information, they have been advocating for people in Fukushima. So she has a lot to tell us. And she's also involved in several lawsuits that the ongoing aftermath of this disaster. So I'm very glad to have Terumi with us. I have three questions for you. The first, you can introduce yourself if you have more that you want to tell us about yourself, but what issues do you face now in your daily life because of the nuclear disaster? That's my first question.
Okay, so maybe let me introduce myself first. Okay, my name is Kataoka Terumi. I was born in Fukushima and I was raised here. And also I raised 4 sons here. When I look back these years, I of course remember the struggles and the tears and angers, but also I'm remember the people who supported us in various ways by praying or just visiting us and also inviting me. And you are the one of those people. So I really would like to say thank you for supporting us over the 10 years. Thank you.
So I'm going to be talking about, what changes happened in our daily life. So there are so many differences now compared with our life 10 years ago. One major difference is that we can monitor radiation in food, water, soil, and this means that we can gather our own information. So we've been able to measure our own food, and fortunately, the amount of radiation in food items does not exceed the limit or the line that the government has established for, I'm sorry, not the government, but this machine, the gamma ray spectrometer, has its own limits about how much radiation can be monitored in each measurement. And so we feel more safe being able to measure our own food and to know that the radiation levels are low, but that doesn't mean that there's no radiation in the food items.
それから最近その私たちずっと私たちは空間
The
線
other
量
thing
です
that
ね。
we've been doing
そ
is
の
monitoring
どれ
the
ぐらいの空間
radiation in
こ
the
の空
air.
間の中にどれぐらい放射
So
性 物
there's
質
an
があるのか
organization
とい
called
う
Safecast
こと
that
を
works with
放
us,
射性物じゃない
and we can
線
put
量
a
が
contraption on
放
our
射線
car
放射能の
and
線量が
drive
ど
through
れ
the
ぐらい
area.
高いかというのを
And
図
then
を公
this
開しています。
contraption
セーフ
just
キャス
picks
ト
up
と
the
いう
amount
外
of
国人の
radiation
方が立ち上げ
and
た団体
records
と
it.
一緒に
So you can see on the
車
map
や
as
車
you
に
go
つけてそれ
closer
を
to the
装置
reactors,
を
the
つけて走らせるこ
the
と。
levels
そうす
go
る
from
と下
blue
の
to
ところ
red.
にその
And
数
so
値と
they've
し
been
て色別
monitoring
で出てくるっていうようなことも
radiation
今
in
やっ
the
て
air.
ますし、
And so this
右側は
picture
情
on the
報セン
right
ターの玄関
is
になり
the
ますけれども、
entrance to our
右上の
our radiation
壁のところ
information
にまた
center,
セーフキャストと
and
いう
we
サイ
have
ト
a
もあり
little
ますけ
monitor
れども、
made by Safecast
これは常
at
時
the top of
数
our
値を
above our door.
測って
So
いる
so
こ
each
と
time
と、
you
こ
open
の
the
ドアを
door,
開けて
it
内側
tells
に
you how
入る
much
と、このよう
radiation is
な
in the air,
数値を見ること
and
が
there's
できる
another
ので、これ
monitor
私の
inside.
家の
So
中といいます情報セン
each
ターの
day
中なので、私はこれ毎日見ていますけれ
Terumi
ど
is
も、
looking at
こう
this
いう空
monitor
間を測る、
to
空間線量を
get a
測る
sense of
ことをずっとやっています。
the radiation in the air.
やはり
And on
暑が
windy
りすぎる
days,
時には
the
その
amount
数値
of
は上がり
radiation
ま
in
す。
the air
つま
goes
り
up,
木に
and
つ
that's
いているとか
because
壁などについている
radiation
そ
that
の放
is
射性物質が
stuck
この壁で
to
こう舞い上
like
がって
the
それ
leaves
をキャッ
in
チす
the
るということ
forest
になると
get
なってし
stirred
まう
up
とし
and
てるんだ
and
と
picked
思
up
いま
into
す。
the air.
2
So
月
there
13
was a
日
big
に
earthquake on
ま
February
た
13th,
福島県や宮城
and
県で大きな地
obviously
震があったのです
there's
けれ
not
ど
going to
も、
be a
その時
spike
も
in
私は
the
特
amount of
に、
radiation in
す
the
ぐに
air
そ
as a result
の放
that
射
the
性物質
Fukushima
がね、福
reactors,
島第一か
were
ら飛んで
shaken
く
up.
ると
That
は思えま
there's
せ
not
んけ
going to
れ
be
ど
an
も、
immediate
やはりこ
spike,
の
but
放射
Terumi was
性水
very
をその
concerned
後
and
領事
kept
を
an
呼ぶ
eye
ようにして
on,
います。で幸いなこ
what
とに、
changes
まあ、
could
今のと
be
ころ措置は悪いない
registered
ところ
after
です。
that earthquake.
もちろんこ
So
こ
Terumi's
は
place
福
is
島第
about
一から
100
100キロ離れ
kilometers,
ているの
60
で、
miles
まあ、とて
from
も遠い
the
ところとも言
reactors.
えます
She
し、こ
didn't
こま
think
で
that there
その
would
数
be an
値が上がる
immediate
ようなことが
effect
これは本当
from
に奇
that
跡な状況だと思うんです
earthquake.
けれども、
But
まあ、こうやっ
it's
て
very
日
important
常
for
的
us
に
these
私た
days
ち
to
の
be able
空
to
間
be in
線量
charge of
を
our own
測る見
monitoring,
るということ
to
はとて
gather
も
our
大
own
事だと思い
information,
ます。
and
こ
to
れからも
protect
大
our
切
own
だと思います。
lives.
そうです。そ
I'd
の
like you
前
to see
に
our
私た
church.
ちの教会をちょっと見ていただいて、ここが私た
And
ちの教
so
会です。
I am
そしてこの後
presently
ろにある
in
緑色の
the
建物
building
の
behind
2
the
階に
church
今私はいます。
on the second floor right now.
思いま
So
す。
I wanted you to know that
こ
our
ういう建物
activities of
この
the
敷地の中
Asia
に
Aizu
私たちは
Radiation
この
Information
敷地の中で
Center
私たちは
are
活動すると
located
いうことを
within the
まず
grounds of the church.
お知らせしたいと思います。まずこちらを見てい
So
ただ
these
くと、
pictures are
これは
taken
今私
from
がいる部屋
the
の
window
すぐ目の前
where I
の
am
ところ
right
にな
now.
り
They're
ます。
right outside,
いいです
yes.
か。そして
And
こ
we
のリネン
have
布
this
が
piece of
あります
cloth
けれども、これを
hung
3ヶ月間
outside
ずっと
for
干しっ
3
ぱなしに
months.
しました。
And this is a way for
そ
us
れ
to get a
は
sense
こ
of
の
how
空
much
間が
radiation
ど
is
れ
in
ぐ
the
らい
air.
その放射性
We
物質
were
が飛んで
looking
いる
for
のか
cesium
という放射線量
134
が
and
どれぐらいあるの
137.
かということ
And
を測定するも
fortunately,
のでしたが、
there was
幸
no
いなことに、セシウム、134と
nothing
137
registered
と
from
も
our
に
3-month
検出でした。
test. And in particular, the building that
特
you
にこの
see in
目
the
の前に
picture
見
on
え
the
ている大
left,
きな建物は
that's
高
a
校の体育館で、ここは
sports
高校生たち
gymnasium
がよ
for
く
a high school,
歩
which
きま
means
す。
a lot of high
で
school
砂
students
場なの
are,
で、そ
passing
の
through
砂
this
が舞い上
area.
がることに
And
よ
then
って
outside there,
放射
there's
性
a
物質
lot
の
of
拡散がある
sand.
かなと思ったん
And
だ
if
けれどもな
the
かったということ
wind
ですね。
stirs up the sand, that could cause radiation in the air. And so they were trying to, protect young lives as well by monitoring that. We also monitor the amount of radiation from the dust particles that collect in that bag inside your vacuum. And I apologize that everything's in Japanese, but you can see the figures here. And this represents the figures that came from the vacuum cleaner that I use in the parsonage where I live. The amount of dust particles was 141.1 grams, and the amount of radiation was 163 becquerel. Although the amount of dust particles was only 141.1 grams, if you take that and make it into a one kilogram, the amount of becquerels would be 163 becquerels. So 163 becquerels per kilogram is a very high figure. But this is a very common reality. We've gotten used to, in a sense, or it's very customary to have to deal with this amount of radiation in our daily life. You may know that in Japan, Japanese culture, we take off our shoes before going into the house. So we all take off our shoes when we go into the house. But, we open the door and the wind brings things into the home, and we live with this radiation in our house. So now I'm showing you the figures we found from our vacuum machine at church. And people walk in with their shoes to church. So the total amount of dust particles was 430.9 grams. And if you round that up to per kilo, it would be 819 becquerels. And so the point here is to say that the parsonage and the church are on the same ground. They're right next to each other, and yet you have such a big difference. And so what we know is that radiation is, sticking to the soil. And when we walk, we pick up particles on our shoes, and we carry those particles into the buildings that we walk into. And the organization that did these measurements for us was very surprised with this outcome. First of all, we know that before this disaster, we know the figure was not zero. That means, we had the Chernobyl disaster, and we have these nuclear testing happening all over the world, and so nobody lives completely unexposed to radiation. The white dots. These areas are 50 becquerels or lower. She thinks that 50 becquerels or lower was the normal. In April, we're going to be celebrating Easter, but ever since this disaster, we used to do Easter egg hunts outside, but we have stopped doing that because we don't want our children to be at risk from the amount of radiation just outside. So we've been very cautious about, being involved outside, especially, the children touching the soil and such. But now with this new realization of the amount of radiation indoors in our church, we have to think about how to do an egg hunt in the church without, maybe we put them on chairs or in places that are easier to clean. Now we're more conscious about, what we're facing indoors as well, thinking together about, best practices for how to protect the people who come to church. What health troubles have resulted since the nuclear disaster? So the first thing that the government did was thyroid testing for all young people age 18 and younger. The population in Fukushima at that time was 380,000 children. This 380,000 represents the number of children who at the time of the disaster were 18 and below, and also including children born within a year of the disaster. Previous to the disaster, the number of children who came down with thyroid cancer was 1 or 2 per million. On January 15th this year, the government announced or shared that out of this 380,000 population, out of the children who were tested, 252 children either had thyroid cancer or they had all the symptoms, but not quite there yet. So anyway, 252 children. And then out of 252, 203 have had thyroid surgery. This figure is what the Fukushima Prefecture has announced. And so Fukushima Prefecture is only responsible for their prefecture. And so that there may be other people outside of Fukushima Prefecture that also have come down with thyroid cancer. There's the Fukushima Children's lawsuit that Terumi is involved with. And in one of the hearings, a doctor, Suzuki, who is one of the main doctors who has provided information about thyroid cases in Fukushima, he said in court that there was several cases in which he was involved with people who did have thyroid cancer, but that these people came from out of prefecture, and so they're not included in this figure of 252. And that's just to back up her point that the only figures we have are the figures for Fukushima, but the damage doesn't have borders. It goes beyond Fukushima. This was the Fukushima Prefecture Task Force. They come together every once in a while to formulate their ideas around what's going on in Fukushima. So on January 15th, that's when Dr. Suzuki provided his information. But what was very important about this finding, what the consensus of the January 15th meeting was that they found that there was one girl who was age, just born, not 1 year yet, and also her sister, another girl who was 2 years old, who both came down with thyroid cancer when they grew up. And this was very important because the official line that the Fukushima disaster is fundamentally different from Chernobyl. And in Chernobyl, small children came down with thyroid cancer, but in Fukushima, they're not. Children are not getting cancer, small children. And so the fact that they found a less than 1 year old and a 2 year old who came down with thyroid cancer, it just takes the carpet from under their argument. A lot of scholars who are on the side of the government are beginning to argue that it's been 10 years and let's discontinue the thyroid testing or this task force looking into the situation, that the issue is already passed. But there are also other voices who are saying, no, it's only been 10 years and we've got to continue monitoring the situation. So there's an ongoing argument about how long
いう声も今上がっていて、
the government
そ
will
の
be
甲状
involved
腺
in
検査を
monitoring
続
the
けるか
situation.
続けないかということも今大きな話題になっています。
Because of the basic understanding that came out of the Chernobyl disaster, Chernobyl, the result of Chernobyl was that health risks could only be proven in cases of thyroid cancer. And so that's why the Japanese government was so concerned about measuring thyroid cancer. But Terumi feels that the health damage from radiation exposure is not just limited to thyroid cancer. It's very hard to prove what kind of health damage is a result of, we have this word in Japanese called being radiated inside. When you take in radiation into your body, it wreaks havoc all over the place, and yet it's hard to prove. It takes a long time for us to, to really prove that this is a result of radiation. So this is very unfortunate that the people who were evacuated from the vicinity of the nuclear plant had to move many times. An average of 4 times, but some people had to move as many times as 22. That government housing, at first it was like an elementary school, and then it progressed into a better place, and then the government provided another place. And so this kind of consistent moving and evacuating had a toll. And people just they weren't able to sustain themselves. So we have to lift up the fact that it's not just exposure to radiation, and that our health also depends on our environment, and that when your environment changes so drastically so many times, it has a toll on a person's health. It's very hard to link our health issues directly to radiation. It's extremely difficult. What are some of the struggles that you are involved in? Global Ministries has been supporting you in your efforts to advocate for the people in Fukushima, and we often don't hear about the ongoing struggles that people are involved in. So please share with us. So the government, in order to protect children in Fukushima, they placed these monitoring machines, 3,000 of them, all around the prefecture of Fukushima. So here's a little boy who's entering first grade, and this gives you a sense of how big the monitoring post is. By the end of 2020, they explained that they were going to take away, out of 3,000 monitoring posts, they were going to take away 2,400, only leaving 600. And the explanation was that because it's been 10 years and there's not much to do, there's no reason to have as many. So that was the official explanation. But later they found out that the recovery department of the Japanese government was going to close at the end of 2020, and they wanted to use up their budget. So we quickly went to the government and started presenting our case that we wanted those monitoring posts to remain, first because they are something that anybody can look at and gain a sense of the amount of radiation. And also there's the issue that if there's another earthquake or anything that happens to the Fukushima reactors, these monitoring posts would also benefit us to let us know if we really needed to escape or not. So they are, they're a part of our life, and we need them. And not only did we go to the government, young mothers with their children on their backs, we went to the prefecture leadership, we went to the local township leadership, and we gathered signatures and with a statement about, why it was important to keep these monitoring posts in place. And this kind of activism, or our efforts really took hold in Fukushima. And this map is of Fukushima Prefecture, and the area in dark blue are the small townships in which we were able to protect our monitoring posts. After all of this effort, public opinion of the local people of Fukushima was so powerful that the government decided not to remove any of them. So I want to point out that this is the first time that public opinion was able to sway national policy, that the government had put in place a certain, the government had its own plan about what they wanted to do, but public opinion was able to change that. The second issue is the release of radioactive water into the ocean. The government has announced their intentions to release radioactive water that is in these containers. They're going to run out of space, and so they need somewhere to let this go. And so they're going to release this radioactive water into the ocean. There are many reasons that we have been opposing this. So those women holding signs, saying don't dump radioactive water into the ocean, save the ocean. We've been doing many activities to raise awareness. Yeah. We also have made many visits to have our voices heard at the Japanese government on this issue. So there's a system called public comment, where the Japanese government provides a window of opportunity for citizens to voice their opinions about a certain issue. Now, I'm sorry, I can't come up with the figure of how many public comments were provided, but the government was actually surprised at how many came in, and that this strong public opinion is influencing the Japanese government. So the government was hoping to make their decision last September, but because of the groundswell of public opinion around this issue, we've been able to push back, and they have not been able to make their decision to move forward. And we're hoping that we can continue this resistance. This is what we call the Fukushima Children's Lawsuit, or Children's Trial Against Radiation Exposure. Global Ministries has been supporting this. August 2014 was the date that this lawsuit was filed, and the result is going to be announced on March 1st. So each time we have a hearing, citizens gather around the Fukushima port, and we have a time to make speeches and raise consciousness, gathering our efforts to support this effort. So there are 30 lawsuits having to do with the nuclear disaster in Fukushima. And most of these lawsuits have to do with the fact that because of the disaster, people have lost their homes and their communities and their livelihood. And so they're asking for reparations. But the Fukushima Children's lawsuit is a little bit different from these other lawsuits. One of our grievances is that not everybody living in Fukushima is able to escape. And so there are families who need for various reasons to stay in Fukushima, and they have children who need to go to school. And so then the responsibility of the local government and the national government to provide a safe environment or a safe place for these children to study. And the second issue is that following the disaster, the government and the local prefecture failed to protect the children. For instance, there's something called a stable iodine, which helps to protect the thyroids, especially right after a disaster like this. They didn't pass out any stable iodine to the children. We are expecting that this final verdict is going to involve some very difficult decisions on the part of the judge, because it's very hard to prove that health risks have resulted from radiation. One year ago, religious leaders came together to file a lawsuit against the nuclear cycle, which targets Japanese national policy that says that used plutonium can be recycled and used again, right? So they have a recycling plant in Japan. So there are 239 plaintiffs. Some are religious figures like Buddhist priests or Shinto priests, Catholic priests and Protestant pastors, and then lay leaders. So our argument first is that nuclear energy policy is against the Constitution and against our morals. We have a moral obligation to speak out against this national policy.
Are there currently restrictions on fishing or seafood from the Fukushima coastal area or in any other areas?
So for long 8 years, fish in and around Fukushima was being tested, and they were not allowed to be on the market. And so it's only recently that the fishing industry has received the go-ahead to be able to sell their fish on the market. It's just recently. I must point out that it's not only the citizens who are against releasing this radioactive water into the ocean, but the fishing, Fukushima Fishing Union, and also the Japanese, the whole nation fishing union is against the release of radioactive water. I may just add that this radioactive water that comes in touch with the nuclear reactors is collected in these big tanks on the grounds of the nuclear plant like this. And they have enough for the time being, but they're going to run out of any space by the end of 2022. We are very aware that governments don't change their policy just because local people make a fuss, because it has to do with your own sense of pride. And so Terumi and her friends, they want to work on public opinion such that it comes from within, that they will be able to find alternatives to what the government is planning. These pictures show the younger generation that is active in protesting. The top right picture is that, and then the top left picture is Terumi herself. And this is by the ocean in Fukushima at a shopping mall. It's a citizens standing protest. People who go to the shopping mall pass by here.
One of the very significant impressions I got when I visited, I think it was March of 2019, with Jeffrey, and Reverend Kataoka drove us around, we heard about a lot of the social dislocation that occurred, and some of the social attitudes directed towards the region affected. We heard stories about how some people may have moved from Namie to Fukushima, and some from Fukushima to Tokyo or other places. Some of them were forced to because their homes were destroyed. But then when they moved, sometimes they had to hide where they were from because of the shame. And there was lots of feelings of scapegoating going on.
As I was listening to your question, a lot of different cases of people that I know came to mind, and it's very difficult to say one thing about such a diverse amount of different stories and cases. For instance, one person who works with me here at the center is a person who evacuated on her own account from an area that was very affected by the radiation. They have a house in Fukushima City, but they have come to our city because the husband has started a new job. So if I were to ask her, where do you think you belong? She would probably answer, that's what I've been asking all of this time, and I still don't have an answer. So the decision they made to leave their home in Fukushima City and come to live in Wakamatsu really affected her children, for instance, who have been struggling with a sense of shame, even within Fukushima Prefecture. There are areas that are more, stigmatized than other areas. And so her family made the decision to leave Fukushima City and come to Wakamatsu. But her two daughters have really struggled with that, attending schools in Wakamatsu and being pointed out or discriminated against, and struggling with their sense of shame and maybe depression. And if they had decided to just stay in Fukushima City, would her daughters have been happier? It's hard to sort of know whether your decision was a right one or not. Every year in March, the government will announce how many people died and how many people were evacuated. What has recently come to attention is that the number of people reported, that the government reported evacuated, is at least 30,000 different from the actual number.
So many layers of consequence from this one event: health, legal, environmental, technical, political, social, religious. So many layers, and it would take many more conversations and dialogues to unpack all of them. Perhaps we'll have that opportunity. One reason that many of the public in the United States and around the world will again have their attention drawn to this area is because of the Olympics, or the potential Olympics. We know that there's a lot of uncertainty about that. But as I understood before, and now there are all sorts of COVID politics tied up there. But it appeared that it was just emblematic of the government's lack of accountability, lack of rationality, lack of responsibility when it comes to making good decisions for the safety and the health of the people versus public relations and and economic decisions. So the Olympics may not happen regardless. But I know that a lot of people would have their attention again turned to Fukushima as a result of that.
Becca Cho and I, of course, had the pleasure to participate in the interview directly with Terumi. Over more than 2 hours, we heard many stories and details about her experience, and we've sought to capture um, the essence of that in this portion of that interview here. Terumi has been very busy even in the time since then. She mentioned the children's lawsuit that was expected to receive a hearing, a decision on March 1st. And that hearing was, went to court. Unfortunately, we heard the report that the judge more or less dismissed the hearing. On factors that the case um, could not be warranted and did not have sure standing. Um, but Jeffrey speculated that perhaps it appeared the judge was under political pressure not to entertain it. But the coalition bringing the children's lawsuit has appealed that, and so that continues. Just yesterday, Tarumi reported uh, and gave a clip of some testimony that she provided at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Um, that testimony, like many things, are being done virtually, but she provided a brief testimony as part of a large group of women who were reporting on various human rights situations. And she uh, was addressing specifically the proposed plan to release the contaminated water into the ocean as a human rights issue. Today, Terumi shared some images from um, a demonstration that she participated in against the Olympics. The Olympics that were to have been held last year, the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, were of course moved to this year, nobody knowing exactly what the COVID situation would be. Yet there's been opposition in Japan for uh, the years leading up to this because there's a perception that the government of Japan has been intending to use the Olympics as a public relations effort to claim that everything is okay in the Fukushima region, that there is not a safety concern. In fact, you can hold a professional Olympic sporting event here, and in fact, many of the venues and training facilities are in and around the Fukushima Prefecture itself. There was a plan, in fact, to have the Olympic torch carried down a roadway adjacent to the coast, right through the air, which to this day you can see levels of contamination reported on the monitors along the highway as you drive through. So many people, some still concerned, of course, about the risk of crowds gathering while the coronavirus pandemic is still a threat, but also many people not wanting the government to paper over the real risk that to the environment and to people's health still posed by the contamination in the area. We heard a lot of details about how the signs of the cleanup and the threat still exist in the barrels of contaminated water and in the bales of contaminated soil that line the roadways from the coast up into the mountains. We have, this is an opportunity